You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Welcome to the Past Macabre, where we journey through history to discover how our relationship with death reflects the values, fears, and hopes that shape the way that people live. I'm your host, Stephanie Rice. Thank you for joining me for episode 20, the Wag Festival, Ancient Egypt's summertime celebration for the dead. The Wag Festival is one of the oldest festivals in ancient Egypt that we see specifically identified in the archaeological record. It commemorates the death of Osiris and is a day for honoring deceased loved ones through feasts for both the dead and the living. In this episode, join me to explore the evidence found in tomb reliefs and stone offering tables and the very first pyramid texts from the tomb of Unas. And I'll share some of the specifically named offerings that were part of the feasts held to honor the dead and the Osiris myth that inspired it all. Now let's get started. Around this time of year, 4,370 years ago, possibly to the very day you're listening to this, depending on when it reaches you, the family of the official Mersunak, who was overseer of the young men of the palace and inspector of the Ka priests, were preparing a feast in his honor for the Wag Festival. The royal palace would have been buzzing with activity on this day too. This was the first year that a feast was held for Unas, the previous king. It was very important for the new king to get it right, because this was one of the many acts he would have to be constantly performing in order to prove his legitimacy in the divine lineage of kings. Unas had died without a male heir to take the throne from him, as was the custom in ancient Egypt established by this time. But in order to avoid a succession crisis, a woman named Sesheshet, who was a very powerful woman amongst Egyptian nobles based on her ability to arrange this, was able to arrange the marriage of her son Teti to Iput, who was the daughter of Unas. Many of the elites would have been relatives of Unas, and the marriage was very clearly not popular from other texts and evidence that we've seen in the archaeological record. So even though the Wag Festival didn't typically have political connotations, the first few hosted by Teti likely did. The Wag Festival commemorated the death of Osiris, but it was not like a large celebration with citywide parades or public formality. A lot of the more famous festivals like Opet were. It was a celebration that was more a celebration for friends and family to come all together and remember deceased loved ones. They would supply their soul with food and drink in the afterlife and honor their journey to the Aru, or Field of Reeds, where Osiris ruled over all of the worthy souls who had made it through the Duat and all of the challenges it took to get there. If you want to learn more about all of those, there's a whole episode about it. It's episode 6, The Journey Through the Ancient Egyptian Underworld, the Duat. Otherwise, obviously it takes a whole episode to go through, so I won't be spending the time here. Honoring the dead was an important aspect of ancient Egyptian life, and it's thanks to that important aspect that we have so much information about ancient Egypt in the archaeological record. Clearly, everything was so important, and it mirrored the way that the real world was to them. It was basically meant to be a continuation of an idealized version of their current life. For example, somebody who was a craftsperson wouldn't have to be doing the hard labor, but they would get to do the fun part of their job for all of eternity. And similarly with people who were of every other profession. And then, of course, the pharaoh would continue to rule as rulers do in the afterlife, and they would all become part of Osiris's world. Without this belief system, I would not have very much to actually study as an Egyptologist, so thank you, ancient Egyptians. To them, ancestors were seen as an advocate or an intermediary for the living when it came to conveying messages to the gods and then ensuring that ma'at, or balance, was upheld. By honoring them and then keeping their memory alive, the living would be granted an abundant and happy life, and then that would continue on to their afterlife as well. And Egypt is run by a lot of cycles, and both the natural and supernatural worlds. The cycle of life and death constantly continue throughout their narrative with essentially continuity, with the only hiccup being whether or not you can get through the duat and prove that your soul is worth that continual eternal life. This is also why Teddy, despite being a non-blood relative of Unas, would have still been required to provide this service, this feast, this celebration in Unas's name, because essentially his father-in-law not only would have been an important head of the family that he was following in the footsteps of, but it was very important in ancient Egypt to have the continuous cycle of the kingship that was unbroken in the same way that the natural cycles were meant to be unbroken. Imbalance within the kingship meant imbalance in the physical world to them. And then, of course, the downside to many of the elites being relatives of the royal family is that you're not only going to have to be putting on the professional face whenever you are in court, you're also going to have to be dealing with them when you're at these sorts of family gatherings. There was still formalized rituals involved with the Wag Festival, even though they didn't have the large processions and more elaborate temple rituals that some of the other festivals had. But the festivities for Wag began the evening before, on what's often referred to as just the eve of Wag, with everyone who would have been involved gathering together for a procession to light the cook fires and lamps that would have been part of the celebrations. And each person that would have been filing along in this procession would present an offering of a single loaf of white bread. And these texts do specify white bread. There's several different types of bread that are brought up in the different what are called formulas for these feasts, and I'll go into those details later. But for now, the initial procession would have just been the offering of this single loaf of white bread from each individual, and then the priest who was leading the procession would have had a basket with several dozen pieces of flatbread. According to some officials, they even got hundreds of flatbread with their offerings, and a jar of beer, or 2 or 3, again, depending on how rich the elite was in life, that they would have been able to establish that standard to be continued into death. And then later during the festivities, possibly that night or during the festivities the next day, a nursing cow was sacrificed. And it is specified a nursing cow, which would have been an important symbol of abundance, rather than just a bull that would have been the pretty stereotypical symbol of vitality, therefore life. A nursing cow is more of an agricultural abundance and a celebration of more than just an individual life, more than just the single masculine life, because it represents both the cycle of new life with the birth being given to the cow and the fact that milk was a very important part of the Egyptian diet and rituals as well during the period. Milk was a very common offering that was left during funerals and during a lot of other festivals. And it was always associated with pretty much every mother goddess because of milk coming from mothers. And that one seems pretty obvious. And so it has several layers of meaning tied to it. A quarter of this sacrificed cow would have been brought back to the offerings for the deceased, at least according to a lot of the texts we have. Again, that was probably more on the well-to-do elite side of things, and there probably would have been a quarter of whatever was available for the family of the deceased, depending on how well off the participants were. Another quarter of that sacrifice would have been given to the temple who was leading the processions involved with the Wag Festival, which for most of the Egyptian history, it would have been the Temple of Anubis, even though it's associated with the cult of Osiris, there's a lot of overlap in responsibilities when it comes to the temples. Even if this was meant to venerate Osiris as the main mortuary temple, the Temple of Anubis would have been heavily involved in essentially providing their services for symbolic mortuary practices as well as the physical real ones. And then after payment was made to the temple, essentially, there would have been other offerings as well, but we'll go into that later. After the payment was made to the Temple of Anubis, then the remaining half of the sacrificed cow would have been left for the celebration feast that the living would have had. The specific examples that I've provided of a very exact date of this Wag Festival, they come from the archaeological record. So first, we have the official Mersu-Ankh, who was overseer of the young men of the palace, which would have meant he basically was the administrator, head teacher, boss man of all of the young men as they were coming into adulthood, who were either directly princes as sons of the king, because Unas did actually have sons. It's just that not any of them survived into adulthood past him in order to take the throne, though he didn't rule a terribly long time, so most of them would have likely died when they were fairly young. And he would have also overseen the elites as well, the children of the elites as well, who would have been in the same circles as those princes, and essentially trained them into the various positions they would have had as different officials once they came of age. And as inspector of the Ka priests, he would have been very closely tied to a lot of the funerary rituals that were happening, because the Ka priests are the people at mortuary temples, mostly the Temple of Anubis, especially during this period, who were specifically tied to maintaining the Ka, or the spirit of a specific deceased person. And their job would be to take care of them during all of the festivals, not just the Feast of Wag, but throughout the entire year, and make sure that essentially their tomb was cared for so that their spirit could be cared for. Mersu-Ankh's mastaba was found in Saqqara, and he was buried fairly close to the other 5th dynasty pyramids and high-level elites. So he definitely wasn't just somebody bragging about a position that really wasn't that important. He actually did hold a very important role. And in his mastaba, there is a specific offering bowl, which is fairly common in the tombs of elites and royals in the Old Kingdom, where they would have a fairly specific layout to them, with different little bowls carved into a larger limestone usually. Sometimes they would be very fancy and get granite. Mersu-Ankh had a limestone offering bowl that had a place for liquid libations like milk or beer, depending on the festival. And then for the physical meals that would be left for him, that would be the offerings of the bread and such. And this is where the procession would end, and all of the offerings would be left for him by the people who were in the procession during the Wag Festival. And this offering bowl that was found specifically spells out that the Wag Festival was one of the festivals that he was meant to be honored during. Now, his doesn't include a very exact feast list like some of the others do. The feast list that I've provided comes from later archaeological evidence, very specifically a 12th dynasty list that goes into detail about what was required of their children and their grandchildren to leave them as offerings. And then also from the 12th dynasty, which was basically the peak of the Middle Kingdom. So there was a lot of documentation going on. A lot of elite tombs were being very highly decorated. And so this information comes from one of the earliest pieces of legal contracts to come out of ancient Egypt, which are also called the inscriptions of Jefahapi, or sometimes the contracts of Jefahapi, and they are literally contracts between him and priests and some political civil officials to maintain his funerary cult long after he's gone. And it even spells out exactly what he has paid them in order to do this, with land and cattle and servants. So he essentially has set up a trust for hopefully generations that will continue to maintain his funerary cult, even if he doesn't have any descendants who manage to live that long to maintain his funerary cult. It was very important for ancient Egyptians to have their memory maintained, because to them that was the only way that they could survive in that eternal heaven or the field of reeds where Osiris ruled, because they had to be remembered. The second that their name was uttered for the very last time was when they died the true death or second death. And to them, that was the worst. That's why things like removing names from monuments was seen as such a horrific, meaningful thing, because in order to remove someone from memory, or damnatio memoriae, that is to kill them eternally, to kill them a second time, to remove them from eternity. And we know that Teti and the family of Unis would have been obligated to celebrate him as well, because even though we don't have explicit instructions for Unis the same way as we do with Mersu-Ankh or the later examples that I provide, there is mention of the Wag Festival in the pyramid texts of the Pyramid of Unis, which are the very first texts or carvings to appear in any of the pyramids. So obviously, the first pyramids, the Great Pyramid of Khufu and the pyramids of Khafre, they don't have any texts on the inside. It wasn't until the end of the 5th dynasty with Unis that any inscriptions at all appear, and within the Pyramid of Unis, it's just walls and walls of texts. These spells or utterances, depending on what translator you go with from what period, are all of the things that are meant to be recited in order to remember Unis, and all of the things that are meant to help him get through that challenge through the Duat and enter the field of reeds. And specifically within these pyramid texts of Unis, we have spell 442, section 820a, that refers to Osiris specifically as Lord of Beer in the Wag Festival. And that's one of the earliest mentions that we have of Osiris and the Wag Festival overall, but specifically it is the very first reference of Osiris in the context of a royal funerary cult. And so the interesting shift during this period is that the rise of the Wag Festival becoming less of just a normal person to an elite thing to also becoming in a royal thing, a royal tradition as well, is also when we see the rise of the Osiris cult. And when, even though, like I said, the Temple of Anubis continues to be important for mortuary practices because that's where mummification rituals are held, Anubis is no longer from this point on considered the quote-unquote main deity of mortuary or funeral rituals. And even though Osiris is actually a fertility god, which is the reason why he's green and the reason why he's associated a lot with harvest and harvest festivals, as you'll see here, lots of feasts and grain in the form of bread and beer because of barley are given in his name more often than many of the other offerings. Like other festivals will have a lot more fruits involved or honey or more variety than just very specific agricultural gains. So just some fun little side facts about Osiris and the rise of his cult during this period as he begins to surpass the Anubis cult. The oldest mention of the Wag Festival comes from the 3rd dynasty, about 300 years before Unis' pyramid was even built. And it's mentioned in the tomb of Mettjen, which is a very important tomb in the archaeological record, not just because of the mention of this festival, but because it's the oldest biography in Egypt and potentially, arguably, the world, depending on if you count the Epic of Gilgamesh as really a biography or not. Within the tomb of Mettjen, there is mention of a lot of the great deeds that Mettjen did, a lot of the roles that he held, and it is one of the first mentions of essentially the demands that one would have of when they're remembered at their Wag Festival. And with such an old inscription, it makes it the Wag Festival one of the oldest festivals in ancient Egypt and the oldest, longest running festival in ancient Egypt. A lot of the other older festivals ended up being replaced over time or merged, and while the Wag Festival did merge at times, it would go through Renaissance periods where it would be brought back as close to its original form as the new celebrators could get based on what they knew. For example, it came back during the Ptolemaic period as the Drunken Feast of Hathor because of the association with nursing cows and beer. There was still obviously the heavy Anubis association as well. There was still a lot of the underworld aspects, but the main focus was a little more to get very drunk in memory of the deceased instead of as much pomp and circumstance as far as the rest of the rituals go. And that was thousands and thousands of years later after that very first mention. Cleopatra would have been celebrating it. So that would have been almost 2,700 years after the fact, after the very first mention in the archaeological record of the Wag Festival. So that's an incredibly long-running festival. The feasts that were had during the Wag Festival would have included, as I said, white bread, which was seen as a luxury bread. It would have been made with white lotus seeds. If you've ever seen a lotus, it's got very large, slightly creepy hive-like looking seed pods. And so the seeds that come out of it are very, like, a centimeter or two across, so they can get very large as far as seeds go. They can be dried and then ground the same way that pretty much any acorn flour or anything like that is made. And then it produces a very fine, whiter flour than was used normally with wheat and normal everyday bread. And that would also have a fairly fluffy, almost cake-like texture to it based on the remnants that have been found in tombs left from these sorts of offering feasts. And then there would also be the flatbread, which is truly just like the Egyptian pita today. And I specify Egyptian pita because if you've ever had pitas from different places around the world, they do have variation to them in the way that they're made. They're going to have different textures slightly and different thickness. Now, the Egyptian pita, which is the aish baladi, is very good, by the way, and I can eat millions of them probably if left to my own devices. And so I can understand those who demanded hundreds their offerings. And that is pretty much the same as what we found in tombs as far as the ancient Egyptian flatbread was. So I'm not saying it's exactly the same, but it's very close. So that technique has managed to sustain for thousands of years, over 4,000 years, and it is still very tasty, I can confirm. If you ever have the chance, go to an Egyptian restaurant, find someone with Egyptian heritage who knows how to make it and beg them to make it for you. Learn how to make it yourself. It's amazing. As for the sacrificed cow, there probably would not have just been one single way that it would have been cooked. Beef especially was salted a lot and preserved. And so as far as the offering for the deceased would have gone, that's how they would have prepared it. They would have treated it essentially like jerky almost, with the way that they would salt and preserve it. And then in some periods, in some places, there are even mummified meat offerings, which are colloquially called meat mummies, and seeing them is pretty funny, actually. I highly recommend going to the mummies section in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, past the human mummies, and check out the animal mummies section, because in that section is where you'll also see meat mummies, such as little wrapped up ribs, just the single beef ribs that are wrapped in their little mummy linens and then placed in their own little rib-shaped sarcophagi. And then there's also huge haunches of beef that will be salted and dried and then mummified in their little linens and wrapped in another little sarcophagus that's shaped like the haunch of meat. And it's a very interesting way that they would take the food offerings with them to eternity in the same way that they would preserve themselves, essentially. I guess if it works. For the living, while they would sometimes eat salted beef, that probably would not be for the feast. They would boil some of the food. There would be broths made of like the marrows, and the tougher bits would be made into like stews and that sort of thing. There would be roasting done of a lot of the already more tender cuts. And then, like I said, the salting and drying would save the rest of it for longer periods, so there wouldn't be waste after this. It's not like everybody would just gorge themselves to try to make sure that this cow didn't go to waste. And then that's also the same for the portion that was given in payment to the temple. That would have most likely been salted and dried and essentially preserved for a later date instead of immediately being turned into a feast. The beer that would have been had during these sorts of feasts wouldn't have been your typical average everyday beer that everybody would have normally drunken at regular meals. It would have been essentially more fortified, stronger beer. Sometimes in later periods, there's evidence that it was dyed in a way with red ochre, which is just like a red stone, basically, so it's not harmful or anything, to give it a color, not necessarily to intentionally make it look like wine, possibly to make it look closer to blood, considering the myths surrounding the fact that these are going to be drunken in celebrating death, whether it is the death of Osiris. Sometimes that same beer was found in celebrations to Hathor or Sekhmet, which both also have a myth associated with having to drink beer that was dyed to look like blood. So there's also other periods where they did have wine. Later periods, once they had more solid wine trade going with the Mediterranean, then there would have been wine included at these festivals as well. The Wag Festival also became a time for both symbolic and physical pilgrimages to Abydos, which was in Upper Egypt or Southern Egypt. As the food for both the deceased and the living was prepared, younger family members would prepare papyrus boats for each person that they were honoring. They were placed on the west side of the tombs at sunset and then moved to the east side of the tombs at sunrise, and this represented the return of the soul to their tomb. In other periods, they would actually make 2 papyrus boats and float them down the Nile, one at sunset and then one again at sunrise, though the currents weren't working symbolically with them. In order to get to Upper Egypt, you have to go against the currents on the Nile. So in later periods, elites began paying craftspeople to make them a pair of model papyrus boats that would be evergreen and eternal, ready to carry their soul on its pilgrimage every single year. One was built with oars that would ensure the journey upstream the way that normal boats would have made that journey. And the other was fitted with sails. And again, that would have been how normal boats sailed back down the Nile towards the north in order to ensure that the journey downstream was successful. These crafted boats wouldn't have been floated on the Nile. They would have been left in the tomb in order to represent that journey spiritually every single year. So that was another shift that started coming about in the Middle Kingdom and the New Kingdom as well, is when we really start to see more of those boats appearing within the tombs. Abydos is over 546 kilometers or 340 miles along the Nile away from the necropolises at Giza and Saqqara. So why was such a faraway place still venerated when the dead were there at Saqqara or Giza? Abydos was a very important location for the Wag Festival because it was the cult center of Osiris, and the majority of the festival centered around Osiris and the Osiris myth. Abydos was also the ancestral burial place for the first kings of Egypt. It's where some of the oldest, clearly royal tombs are located, including the tombs for the very first kings of the first dynasty. Even once the burial grounds started being moved closer to Min-Nefer or Memphis near Saqqara and Giza, they were still building smaller, empty tombs that were still symbolic of the deceased royals being buried there with their ancestors, as well as in the current necropolises. So it's always held a very important cultural memory for the ancient Egyptians since the beginning of Egypt, as we know it as dynastic Egypt. One of the oldest cemeteries in Abydos is at a place that's now called El Kab, which translates to Mother of Pots. And this valley is covered in broken votive offerings that pilgrims left for Osiris over millennia, starting back when Osiris was still a fairly regional cult to this area in the early stages of Egypt's history. The Osiris myth is probably the most famous myth that survives to this day from the entire ancient Egyptian mythology. And it's pretty much been passed down for millennia with bits and pieces in the Egyptian archaeological record. But the most complete version of it is from Plutarch of Chæronea, who wrote it all down based on the bits that he had researched in the 1st century CE. The most complete Egyptian source for the myth is called the Great Hymn to Osiris, which was recorded on the stela of Amenmose, who lived and died around 1200 BCE. And he would have been alive during the Ramesside period or the 19th dynasty. So that was, again, centuries after the Wag Festival had already been going on. And according to this myth, Abydos is where Osiris's head was buried after his brother Set dismembered him. So in the myth, Osiris was a benevolent living god. He ruled over Egypt. He was not associated with the underworld. He was a fertility god, and he taught humanity how to farm, how to use the Nile's inundation period, and how to survive along the Nile, considering all around them there is quite a lot of desert, and the struggle for water or arable land is definitely real there. Everyone worshipped Osiris, everyone looked up to him, and this made his brother Set, who was seen as the god of deserts and storm and disorder, so basically the opposite to Osiris, and therefore everybody did not love him. He became very jealous of Osiris and his realm and his people. Set managed to convince several other conspirators, specifically 72 according to Plutarch, but there's not such a specific count in all of the other pieces of the myth that have been found, and not in the Great Hymn to Osiris either. But Set and his conspirators were able to trick Osiris into essentially climbing into a box that was built specifically to his exact size. And then they locked him in it and threw him in the Nile, and he was sent adrift until he landed along the shores far away. And there he was left to root underneath a tamask tree and for quite a long time. And then Set took his throne, and Egypt was thrown into chaos under his rule. Isis and her sister Nephthys went searching for Osiris. Nephthys was also the wife of Set, and they, in the form of a kite and a falcon, they flew all over Egypt and then into all of the neighboring countries in order to search for Osiris. They eventually found him in the roots of the tamask tree and freed him, and then Isis and Osiris were reunited, and that's when they conceived Horus. Once Set found out that Osiris had been saved, he grew very angry, managed to trick Osiris again, either because Osiris was still trapped or just through other means, and was able to kill Osiris. And this time, he dismembered Osiris into 14 pieces and scattered all of those pieces all across Egypt. And unfortunately for Osiris, even though Isis worked very hard to gather all of his pieces and nurture him back to life, she couldn't complete the set. She was not able to fully revive him. And all of his pieces were not fully gathered. One piece was missing, reportedly his penis, and a lot of the myths that were recorded across the Egyptian tomb art where we find this myth. And that meant that, unfortunately, Osiris had to stay in the underworld. And so this is where he began ruling the Aru, or the field of reeds, where the souls who had led good lives would go after they managed to traverse the Duat in order to get to the field of reeds, or Aru. And because Osiris was now stuck in the Aru, then that's why Horus ascended to the throne to become the new pharaoh. And Horus is associated with the living pharaoh, and Osiris is always venerated as the deceased pharaoh. So in life, the kings would constantly be associated with Horus. They would even have what's called a Horus name, which was one of the main throne names that they would take when they ascended to the throne. And then once they died, all of their mortuary rituals, all of their artwork, everything about their epithets, they would start to shift to referring to them as the Osiris instead of the Horus. So they would become associated with the dead pharaoh in the afterlife, and the cycle would continue in the real world as it did in the myth, with the deceased pharaoh going on into the afterlife and ruling in the Aru alongside Osiris, and then the new pharaoh, the Horus, would rise to rule Egypt just and fairly. But the Wag Festival wasn't all solemn rituals and dwelling on violent death and dismemberment. It was a time for music and dancing and celebrating life as well, as part of the commemorations for the deceased. As a god of fertility, Osiris was tied with the fertility of the land and the Nile floods that brought the fertile silt deposits every single year. This cycle was continued every single year as long as, according to the ancient Egyptian worldview, all of the proper rituals and ma'at was carried out, and balance, or ma'at, was across all of Egypt. And this included honoring the deceased and celebrating them and the continuation of life in this world as well. Even the myth of Osiris's death and dismemberment can be interpreted as a metaphor for the agricultural cycle, and a lot of scholars have taken it this way. The slaying of Osiris can be seen as the cutting of the grain and harvesting of the fields, and then the seeds are going to be separated from the grain and then scattered across the fields. Similarly, Osiris was cut up into pieces and then scattered across the land. And in later celebrations that were associated with Osiris that came long after the Wag Festival, people began making small mummies that were specifically stuffed with grain, like corn dolls in some more modern harvest festivals. And they would create Osiris-shaped grain beds, basically, where it would be like a flower bed, but it would be specifically for growing grains in it. And these would be also a way that Osiris's death and life would be honored. During different periods in Egypt's history, the Wag Festival held a different place of importance. In the Old Kingdom, it seemed to be very important, but was still held at a fairly local level as far as the feast size go. So again, it wasn't like a huge citywide celebration was going on. There wasn't something that was a ton of people coming here just to celebrate the death of a pharaoh or anything like that that's seen in some of the other larger festivals. But then in the Middle Kingdom, we do start to see an increase in the amount of goods that are starting to be provided into the feasts and the mentions of it as well. As the cult of Osiris gained popularity, the Wag Festival did as well. And then it became a much larger event, with some tombs alluding to actual performances that would have been done recreating the Osiris myth. And those would have possibly been the oldest form of theater, which they would have happened 1,000 years at least before theater was created in Athens. So Unfortunately, we only have references to those and not any very solid evidence that we can say for sure this is exactly what happened. These plays were put on, and therefore this was the birth of theater. But it is very interesting to see various tombs throughout both the end of the Old Kingdom, the first intermediate period, and the Middle Kingdom that have these references to the Osiris myth being played out by the priests of the temples, or sometimes even the pharaoh themselves, depending on the time period. But by the time of the second intermediate period and the New Kingdom, the popularity of the Wag Festival started waning quite a lot. And this was also during the time that a lot of the major Theban festivals happened, which are some of the more like iconic ones like the Opet Festival and the Sokar Festival. These sorts of festivals were seen as the more like iconic ancient Egyptian festivals that had the huge processions of the likenesses of the gods on their funerary barks and model ships that would be taken from temple to temple, and massive celebrations that involved rituals performed by the king in front of a huge audience of elites. So these would have become more popular during that period than these smaller localized family celebrations had been. And they slowly took on pieces of the Wag Festival, like the Osirian myth became associated with the Sokar Festival that popped up later, and that was celebrated at Saqqara. And there were other feasts as well that still would include the same types of like offering lists, because even in the Old Kingdom, these offering lists weren't specifically unique to the Feast of Wag. They were amended depending on the season, basically. So there would be like a New Year's feast, and obviously bread and beer would still be involved. There would be other specifics included. And then there would be like a mid-year feast, and similarly, there would be a slightly different menu. The core staples are always going to be bread and beer when it comes to any ancient Egyptian feast. Even in the New Kingdom, there was a lot of bread and beer at those massive Theban festivals. They just would have had much, much larger quantities. And then they would have also begun to import a lot more wine from the Mediterranean as well to include as well. As we're starting to head into the time of year of a lot of the more famous and modern festivals associated with both harvest and the dead, be sure to bake a bit of bread and maybe have a bit of beer in honor of anyone that you may want to remember as part of this Wag feast that's going to be going on roughly from August 17th to August 18th. 17th would be the Eve of Wag, and then the 18th would be the Feast of Wag, based on many scholars' interpretations of the ancient Egyptian calendar. And that would have been based on the civil calendar. And it would have been a fixed date throughout most of Egypt's history, unlike some of the other harvest festivals, which would have been dependent on the lunar phase. Be sure to have some bread and beer in honor of any of your deceased family and friends that you would like to remember as we head into this fall season. And raise a glass to Osiris, ruling over the Aru and all of the worthy souls who have made it to him there through the Duat. And enjoy some of that Egyptian flatbread. Aish Baladi is great, and I will try to link a recipe video whenever I make the social media posts. And for the show notes for this episode, if you can't find any yourself that's made at an authentic Egyptian restaurant, then I definitely recommend trying to make it yourself. Once you try some, you will also understand why hundreds of them were listed as offerings in tombs. They are so good. Thanks for joining me on this look at the Wag Festival, ancient Egypt's oldest festival dedicated to honoring the dead and the Osirian myth. In the next episode, I'll be diving into another summertime festival dedicated to honoring the dead. This time, we'll be taking a look at the Hungry Ghost Festival of Eastern and Southeast Asia. It's coming up too. This year, it falls on September the 6th in 2025. So thank you again for joining me. Until next time. Thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe to keep up with new releases. Please leave a rating and a comment. That helps the show reach others who may be interested in the past macabre. For access to bonus content from all Archaeology Podcast Network shows, become a member at archpodnet.com/members. That's archpodnet.com/members. You can find show notes for this and other episodes at archpodnet.com/TPM and follow Past Macabre on Instagram. That's PAST_MACABRE. You'll find pictures of the sites and artifacts discussed, Q&A sessions, and episode topic votes. Hope to see you there.
The Archaeology Podcast Network is 10 years old this year. Our executive producer is Ashley Airy, our social media coordinator is Matilda Siebrecht, and our chief editor is Rachel Roden. The Archaeology Podcast Network was co-founded by Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle in 2014 and is part of Cultural Media and DigTech LLC.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.